Good evening. Welcome to our Tuesday night hangout from Energeon Publications. There is no biblical office of the pastor's wife, so said somebody that all four of us know here tonight. So, Harvey and Marilyn, is this true? Marilyn, are you a pastor's wife or not? Go ahead.
Yes, I am a pastor's wife, even though at this point in time my husband is not in a pastoral position. When we first got married, he had churches, and we had churches on a circuit for several years before he was called into the chaplaincy, the military, as a chaplain, and that was a different position. And then some years later, after retiring from the chaplaincy, we had a traveling ministry where we both traveled together.
So you know what it's like when someone says there's an expectation of you as a wife or a spouse of a pastor or a leader, but you signed up for it. You knew what you were getting into to start off with.
Yeah, in my situation, Harvey was already in pastoral ministry, and I knew what I was getting into. And it might add, my father was a minister. My mother played the role very well as far as being a support to my father. So,
how about you, Jody? You were talking before we went live about a meeting where you and Marilyn were together with a group of ladies who were married to pastors, and some of them weren't really happy about that, were they?
No, because some of them, their spouses had answered the call of ministry after they were married. In other words, one that comes to mind, he was a CPA, and then he answered the call, and then he was a pastor. He just retired this year, so I guess he was a pastor probably for about 20 plus years. And no, they were very upset, and you could tell by their body language that they were very tense about this. And in my particular situation, before Henry and I were married, it was actually a question that I did ask him. I said, do you feel called to the pastoral ministry? Because I knew I wasn't called to be a pastor's wife. So.
Yeah, but if she had realized what being a publisher's wife was, she might have asked me about that too.
That would have been on the list right below, I don't want to go to Africa. Not a missionary, but there are a lot of different kinds of ministries. So when we talk about being a minister's spouse, it's not just a pastor's wife, but there are folks in full-time Christian service that may not look like the standard pastor thing, but yet has unique demands upon a spouse as they try to fulfill and be obedient to what they sense God's called them to do.
Well, and I think however much we may say there isn't a biblical office of a pastor's wife, there is, in the perception of many churches, an office of a pastor's wife. So when somebody arrives at a new pastor arrives at the church, there's a set of expectations of the pastor, but there's also a set of expectations of what the pastor's spouse is going to do.
I remember an occasion when we were at a new church, and they kept trying to get Marilyn to play the piano. The previous pastor's wife played the piano.
Well, I finally had to do it to show them that I couldn't play. They never asked me again. Actually, I think there was more of an expectation back when we started out of what the pastor's wife, in a local church, should do. And some of them are secretaries. Some are the musicians, or lead the choir, do a Sunday school class, that kind of thing. And I think that's why some spouses feel very uncomfortable, because they feel like they can't fit in that role.
Other people are pressing their expectations of what they want a pastor's wife to be, or a pastor's spouse to do.
I believe that is changing, though, now. I know a lot of my friends who were pastors' wives could fill those roles, could be the musician, lead the choir, do. I helped in a teaching capacity in some areas, help with the children, that type of thing. But I feel like one of the biggest things is you have to feel comfortable with who yourself and who you are and your own identity in Christ, and for one of the other to expect something out of you that you can't feel is not right. But
it's like I can't look to you to fulfill or somehow make up for my perceived deficiencies, or either look to you to make me look good in the eyes of people so I gain acceptance. Although you do look good in the eyes of people, in my opinion.
There's a lot of studies on giftings now. You know, like each of us has our own gifting, and some people know what that is. Some people just fall into a capacity. I was always told that maybe I seem to be a pastoral type. In other words, concerns of the people, taking meals, that kind of thing. And I just did that naturally. That's what I did as a single person, or as a mother, whatever. I filled that capacity. And so in some ways, Harvey's made the mention that maybe he was more of the preacher, and I was more of the pastor, without even it being a role for me.
Your nurturing gifts were very suited to that.
But as far as filling a position or feeling like I had to do something that felt uncomfortable was not my thing. I didn't do that. I mean, I might have felt some expectations, but I could only be myself. And he encouraged me just to be myself.
Did that make it hard or easier in terms of the marriage?
Made it easier.
I was the one that made the marriage.
Our four kids were nothing. It was it makes a difference. Some spouses might expect their wives to fall in that position, and that could really affect your marriage, I think.
Cross expectations.
Cross expectations. You know. Mm-hmm. And
I'd like to get one thing in here because we have the unusual thing of having somebody who has experience both in church pastoral ministry and as a military chaplain. And I know from my own time in the military that there could be quite some expectations of a military officer's wife as well. Did that ever come up in your relationship and your activity? I don't know how it would be in the chaplain's corps. I experienced it with air crew.
Yeah. Well, one of the big challenges at first probably was learning your right from your left. So when they what? Right face, left face. Oh, Jody's going, oh my God. You're going to have to speak to that, honey, because you're the one that fit in with the sort of expectations of the ladies' groups and the officers' wives and things.
There are functions, there are parties and balls and everything you go to. You have to that it's a requirement or it's important for you to go. I'm not saying everybody goes. I wasn't a great dancer, but I went and Harvey stepped on my feet but I'm more introverted. I would go and maybe one-on-one talk to people. He would be around, meet everybody. And then again, I can't say at first there was some things that were uncomfortable, but it all came down to just being who I was, being myself. And there are lots of ladies' functions. I chose. I did have a few maybe minor leadership positions, but at that time our kids were growing up. We had 4 kids very close in age, traveling with them and moving them from one place to the other. I felt that my position was I could support him better if I was heading home. I did some volunteer work, but I tried to keep my focus and my priorities. But you're right. There are some things that they expect you to do. We were already used to having folks in our home and in informal type settings, and so we had soldiers over. But those things came natural for me because I'm more of a homebody. So But I enjoyed that.
Well, that kind of takes me to, I think, maybe the most important question about this particular subject of marriage and ministry is how do you find the balance between, all going out and doing and serving and all that, and having family time and making sure that balance, because I certainly do not think that we could quote anything in the Bible that says, gee, it's wonderful when you're doing all this work for the Lord, and it's okay if your family falls apart while you do it. So, I mean, are there some things that you guys learned along the way in finding out how to have home time where, okay, the ministry's not going to invade this? I mean, how'd you work that?
Part of it was being intentional and being secure enough for me in who I was that, of course I wanted to do a good job. Of course I was in an environment where you're rated, you're informally rated as a rule as a pastor after every sermon. But in the military, direct periods of where your performance is evaluated, and that determines whether you stay in the military, that determines whether you get promoted. But I was secure enough that when I finished my job, I did what I had to do, and then made sure that I scheduled my time as much as possible to do what I had to do as a dad. And I made the soccer games, I did the other things except during periods of deployment, and when it was because of the military function impossible. But we did that and tried to make it work, and it did. But I've run across a lot of children from pastors' families, spouses as well, who bear deep scars because one parent or the other or both conveyed to them in some way that what they were doing was more important than the individual child, and or in another way the strains and stresses of the job were brought home, and the children witnessed the kind of chaos that came in the family circle as the mom and dad discussed the challenges of work in front of the kids or other things. And it's tough on kids, it's tough on families, and when the kids are having trouble, it spills back over into the household. It's forgiveness is a big thing, and I learned to, if I messed up with the kids, to try to tell them, hey, I'm sorry, I messed up, please forgive me. If I did that with Marilyn, tried as well, and it's times it's tough. I mean, there's no way around it.
We try to. There were many resources from the time we started out in ministry that were offered to. We offered to our church family as well as ourselves. And there are times we signed up, like marriage retreats and that kind of thing. We signed up. I remember one time I don't know if any of our parishioners went, but we did.
Lead by example. So we promoted a marriage enrichment weekend, and we signed up, and nobody else did, but it was good for us.
And at different times we've sought out counseling ourselves because we felt like it's needed at different seasons in our life. And
may I tell that story?
Well, the one thing is you can't be your own counselor. As far as ministry, you cannot counsel yourself. You need outside help. And for people in ministry who do counseling, it's very hard because you feel like you're supposed to know the tools to use, but you have to have someone outside, and there's not a stigma to that anymore like there used to be.
Yeah, we've shared this anecdote publicly, so I'm not taking Marilyn's fig leaf off without her permission, so to speak. But there was a time when we lived in Germany, and it was a tough time. I was having a difficulty at work, and there was this undercurrent of anger and frustration that I brought home into the household, and was doing a pretty hard time of masking it. And so Marilyn and I were having what I call an interaction. That's a euphemism for an argument. We were having an interaction, and I was sitting on the bed with my arms folded while she was at the foot of the bed, and she stomped her foot and said, "We need help. We need counseling." And so the next day, I called my boss in the chaplaincy, who
I was holding a gun when I said
that. And I asked him if he would counsel us. He said, I really haven't focused on that for a number of years, but I've got a guy on my staff who does, and I made an appointment, came home and told her that I had a counseling appointment for us, and she almost fell over because she really didn't think that I was hearing, and at that moment I really was listening. And it was helpful. And we were both teaching a Sunday school class about child raising. We're doing it together, and the first session was really talking about how if you're going to really raise your children in a healthy Christian environment, you've got to be on the same page and have the same heart and work on your relationship. That was lesson 1. And we shared during that we were in counseling, and at the end of the Sunday school session, well, what was it like?
I had women coming to want to talk to me because we had been vulnerable, and he had the same.
And I had guys lining up to talk to me after the class, and she had women lining up talking to her, because we shared honestly that it was not necessarily a rosy picture all the time.
And I think Harvey referred to this a little earlier, but the children of people in ministry, if they get the idea that the ministry is more important than they are, or even there have been situations where we're familiar where there have been hurts in the church by the people toward the pastor and his wife, kids pick up on that, and we know a lot of grown men and women who were raised in ministry families who completely turned against the church for that reason, because of the hurts they felt their parents.
Yeah, they've taken on the wounding that their parents felt and owned that. Yeah.
Well, there's a certain amount of balance involved in this, and right now I'm going to balance some of my ministry as a publisher and do an introduction or so, which is, this is my wife, Jody. She's also associate editor and an author herself. And we're talking with Harvey and Marilyn Brown. And Dr. Harvey Brown is author of an Ergion title, Forgiveness, which I think is a really good book title for us to have in here, because having heard everything that we just talked about, I want to ask, what's the role of forgiveness in keeping your marriage alive while you're also in ministry? Or this, I think, could apply to any kind of work, don't you think?
Yeah. Is this a good time for shameless self-promotion as well, Henry?
just so long as you keep it in balance. Shameless. Hold up the book. Yep, that's the book, Forgiveness.
Yeah, and I'm very grateful for you all asking me to do this. The subtitle is Finding Freedom from Your Past, and all of us have a past, and sometimes that past is right behind the present. It's just sort of peeking over our shoulder. And that was one of the things that was going on for us. And you talk about forgiveness. Part of my story is, even though I was a professional Christian, I got paid to do it. I had a shadow world that came into my Christian life. I didn't become a believer until I was very close to 21 years of age, and a university student. And some things changed dramatically when I accepted the Lord, and there were other things that I really wrestled with. And one of the things was occasional forays into the world of pornography. And and by God's grace, in 1996, had a head-on collision with the Lord. Not only did He break that, but gave me the grace to begin to tell the truth. And the first thing I did after I had this power encounter with the Lord in a meeting in St. Louis, Missouri, I picked up the telephone and I called Marilyn and openly confessed and repented to her. And she, after I had received my forgiveness from the Lord, extended grace and forgiveness to me, and that was really one of the things that launched us into the ministry that we're both involved in now. And it's been catalytic and part of the message and the core message that we carry about God's forgiveness and about the necessity to forgive one another, just in the daily collisions of life, collisions of will and expectation and timing, and what other kinds of things do we collide about?
There's the male-female issue.
Yeah.
Not counting the personality differences and things that we have to go through. Also, in dealing with issues with your children, whether they be young or old, you constantly have to work on being in agreement and coming to a consensus on, on actions to take or steps to take. And so I know that's very important. But and like I say, even as far as I'm sort of more of a homebody, and Harvey's more of a out there extrovert going, and so you have to be willing to maybe sacrifice some of your desires or your comfort zone, put it that way, and it's give and take, and in both, I guess any marriage, in ministry, marriage, whatever.
What's been one of the biggest challenges for you guys as you've tried to meld your ministry and your marriage, especially when you're so closely connected in your relationship with the publishing and those kinds of things?
I think probably the major one for us is having a separate life from the business, because of the fact that the business tends, our business, which is also our ministry, is always with us, so to speak. So it's hard in the middle of Sunday afternoon not to start having a business meeting, because all the partners are there, just sitting with the the lunch, the remains of lunch are sitting out there, and there we are, and so that has been a real challenge for us, is to say, okay, this is time that that business is completely off the table. We are not going to talk or do anything about this, so that's, I think that whatever your form of work or ministry, the emphasis may be different, but a lot of the problems are extremely similar. Pastoral ministry may be one thing, but here in publishing, if I have an author who wants to talk to me on a Sunday afternoon, I have to be able to say, no, this is family time. On the other hand, if somebody wants to call Jody and ask her to pray with them, we're going to take that call on a Sunday afternoon, or we're going to take that call at 5 o'clock in the morning. And so that's a matter of priorities. I think one of the dangers is having the pious things, the holy things, that are given more holiness than others. And so, okay.
And part of that too, Henry, I'm sure, especially in a pastoral family, if we're talking about pastoral ministry, if the pastor type is very similar to so many that I've known over the years, and since I've had such a broad experience continually working with other colleagues close in the military chaplaincy environment, a lot of the clergy types are pleasers.
Oh,
and
yeah.
As a pleaser, it's very, very hard to draw boundaries, to say, I'm not going to do that, or I can't do that. But if you're 24 hours on call, if you're always responding to somebody else's need, and the family or the spouse is there going, hey, hello, I just need this hand, and that's the big challenge. What you guys are talking about is so important.
Well, I think you when you're talking pleasing, of all too often, we think we put more effort into pleasing the people who are not as close to us. Mm-hmm. So, you know, in other words, I could go into conflict mode with Jody a lot faster than I would go into conflict mode with somebody else.
Right. Yeah.
And that's a danger, I think, that you have to pay attention to.
Yeah, something that has really been kind of this year a part of my study time, just in general, is, you know, you're sitting there and you're reading this great passage of scripture, and it just all of a sudden would hit me that this passage and what I'm hearing is not just for all the other people that I meet, but it's also for my relationship with Henry. And that if I can't, you know, be washing his feet just as happily and, you know, thinking about doing something that, you know, as I am the, you know, 1,000 other people, whatever, then I've probably not hit the balance very well. And that's kind of been a part of my study time, my devotion time, has been, how does this apply to my relationship with him, not just my relationship to everybody else?
Sure.
As a young mother, I had to early on come to grips with who my ministry was to. We had country churches. Harvey was away in school. And many times I was alone myself in areas and without much communication with anyone. And I had
This is back before the telephone.
Yeah, before cell phone. And with little kids. And I so many of the things that come along with being a young mother with little kids, there were times when I would feel like, what am I doing? I'm not doing anything for the Lord. You know, here I am, you know, because I had been in types of ministry before, helping in Bible schools, doing things, and when I was a college student and for some reason, in the humdrum of changing diapers and doing what young mothers do with it, I had this feeling that I wasn't doing anything for the Lord. And I don't know when this revelation hit me, but somewhere along that time, it hit me and it carried me through a lot of the later years. Was just the scripture that says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself." Who is my neighbor? And really, your neighbor is the ones you're with the closest every day, the ones you run into. And at that particular time, it was my children and my family. And my ministry was to them. But it's hard to see it that way because it's not, you know, changing diapers and washing socks is a lot different, you know. And I think that probably a lot of young mothers and older struggle with this because you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me, Jesus said. And even a cup of cold water that we give. And I'm not saying that to say I had all my ducks in a row or anything, but that's something I had to stick with, a focus that I had to stick with, that I was doing something. This was ministry. This was taking care of my family at that point, and it might change as time goes on in different seasons, but that kept me focused. The main thing. And family was created by God.
I think I've found that the only kind of ducks that ever actually get in a row are the imaginary ones.
Really?
We just really we imagine that our ducks are in a row, but the ducks go ahead and do what they want to.
Yeah.
The toy duck.
I'd like to turn the corner just a little bit on this because we've been talking here about doing ministry and our duty to our family, and we've had in several conversations, especially talking about missions and outreach. For example, the question of a pastor that we know who goes out into the into tent town and spends the night, and we asked her about taking do you take children out in ministry to these things? What is the level of the risk that you do? And we know stories of, missionaries who have lost their lives, missionaries whose children have been ill. I know my parents tell stories of when they thought they had lost one or another of their 4 children, and they nonetheless remained in overseas, ministry service. Where does that giving up your family, as Jesus said, if you can't do that, you can follow me. Where does that fit into our question here?
You look at Jody, I thought, boy, who can answer that?
Harvey should answer this. He's the talker.
Yeah. Boy, that's tough, Henry, and that's where, to begin with, the husband and the wife, or the wife and the husband, the ministry couple, has to be of one heart and one mind. Unless two be agreed, how can they walk together? How can they do that? And that's the first sense, is being together. And I've known people that have really struggled. They've just gone in different directions, kind of like we started off at first. And I have a friend, he was preaching and his wife went to another church. Now, we don't know everything about that, but it spoke volumes. I mean, in other words, it was loud. We don't know what really was there, but there was obviously a disconnect at some level, or some wounding. And when you talk about families on the mission field, or the kinds of risk they're exposed to, those are individual choices that individual families have to make. And I don't know that there is a rule or a standard or a dictum that you can depend on as a universal guide. This is the way to do that. I've got a good friend right now who is in Tanzania, in a really rough place. He, his wife, and his children, and for them, they're thriving. It's an adventure. It's fraught with problems, but they are together, heart and soul on that.
Occasionally, and I think it's important both for the fact that God can call us to do difficult things, but also the fact that sometimes that text is used on people to say, well, you should do this for the church instead of that for your family, because after all, this is God's work. It's kind of the holy lie that says, the church's work is necessarily God's.
Yeah, and the church is first the family, before there was ever anything else. If God wanted something besides a family, He would have us call Him something other than Father, and it's in the home that this is first demonstrated, felt, and lived out. And there is a holy mystery in that, and I don't go too deeply into it, because when things get mysterious, I get weirded out. But this is a picture of Christ and His church first, and if we succumb to an institutional expectation and miss this part, this is going to still be here after I stop professional ministry. I have friends in my age group who are now retired from ministry. They don't have a church, but they still have hopefully, they still have their marriage. And if that hasn't been nurtured, if that hasn't been taken care of, what do you have at the end? You have two people that are going, wow,
Who are you?
Yeah.
And that's what I hear all the way through, probably from all 4 of us, is knowing who you are, knowing your call, knowing your gifts, is always important, because other people always have a set of expectations of you, and there's a very big difference between balancing or having a good marriage while you're following God's call, and having a good marriage while you're keeping up with everybody else's expectations.
Right.
I think too often people's expectations, and especially the expectations of church committees are confused with the call of God.
It can be a tyranny where it's controlling, and you have to draw a line. And part of that is, depending on what kind of church polity you're in. If you're I happen to be a United Methodist by trade. I say, that's my denomination. I don't let that interfere with my Christianity. Actually, it's in many ways a wonderful system. And I have friends who are part of systems where they audition for the church, as it were. Then they get called, and then if they offend somebody or preach a bad sermon, there can be a moving van up in front of their house, and that becomes a kind of tyranny, and they slip into a pattern of, well, I'm going to do everything I can to keep these people happy, and the spouse can be over here on the side going, hey, what about me? And so it's very important, first off, that those expectations, I think, in terms of getting connected with, if you're moving into a new ministry setting, say, hey, here are my values, here are the things that are important, this is where my commitment is, are there any issues with it? And trusting that in the process that God's going to honor that first commitment, and the people that you're going to be working with have to recognize it and honor it too.
I think that's so important to know that, and whether you're in pastoral ministry or any other kind, there's always people's expectations to deal with versus God's. We have a question from the audience. I'm going to select that here. Google Hangouts sets that up so people can actually go find the question and the answer in the video. I don't know if any of you watching knew that, but when you look at the recording through Google Plus, you're supposed to be able to find the question and hear the answer. So I'm going to select this question. Janet asks, what are some ways to involve your kids in the ministry? Which I think, possibly it also has to do with somewhat of the conflict. If your kids are involved in working with it, you're going to have less of a problem dividing between them and the ministry because they're right there in it. I can certainly testify that my parents worked that way, that we went with. I mean, my earliest memory of going on a mission trip, I was about 7 years old. We were loading stuff on a mule to go through the mountains of Chiapas, Mexico, and do a clinic, more than a day's, right about a day's ride away from the nearest road. And so I went along, and my job was to haul out the trash for the clinic all the time, which was, by the way, quite an effort for a 7-year-old. Or I may have been 8. Anyway, I was young. So what does anybody else think, getting children involved?
Well, as in the pastoral ministry, or actually even in the chaplaincy, I know our children were involved in Christmas plays and dramas, things like that, and they seem to enjoy that. I know this is a little bit aside, but I know that there are different places where we were. There weren't always things that were for the children, like in the program, for instance, the Sunday school program, and I know Harvey was the main chaplain at that time. Our kids basically said, we're not getting anything out of it. We're not really learning. We're just sitting and talking. And I went against what my paradigm was of always going to the Sunday school where my dad was, and it was going against the paradigm, but I didn't want my children to be resentful of the church or the setting there. And so I said, well, okay, we'll just stay home and we'll have our class here. So I had them for a period of time, since they said they weren't getting anything out of the particular program.
Yeah, it's kind of tough when you're dealing with a volunteer, and
And I
Yeah.
did that because I didn't want them to go just because they had to, or their dad was the chaplain there and it was expected of them to go. Because in spite of the fact that you try very hard not to let your kids feel like they're on exhibit, I really tried very hard at that. But still, talking to them now as they're grown, they still felt like they were being scrutinized, or that they were supposed to be the example. And I don't know that I ever even used those terms. So in a case like that, I allowed them to participate and do their own type of learning for a period of time at home.
One of the things I've seen is I know that one of my sons and his wife have taken their daughter with them when they were involved in helping and hand out food or distribute food to underprivileged people, things where they were giving and helping, like you were saying, Henry, things where they're going out beyond themselves. And one of the challenges is, I know in the church in the developed world, I'll talk about the North American church, so much of what is done is focused on providing something for the children. Okay, we've got to have a program for the children, have to have an excellent youth group for the children, have to have this for the children, but there's very little opportunity to really, for the children to participate in giving. Is always, how are we going to receive? What's going to be the youth group trip this year? What are we going to do here? Without actually getting in and getting your hands dirty and helping someone. In the local church that we attend right now, the youth group went on a mission to Honduras, into a poor part of Honduras last summer, and these kids came back radically changed. Not only did they get involved in helping ministries, but they also were trained to pray for people. So you've got kids coming back who don't have driver's licenses, who are now fired up because they've learned how to actually pray for someone. And when they were back, first thing I did when an invitation was given, they asked the kids to come forward to pray for folks. I went up and let a ninth grader pray for me, and it was wonderful. They can do this. They can get engaged, and we can get our children involved. You don't want to push them, but you invite them. It's like the old Henry Blackaby saying, find out what God is doing and join him. And invite your kids to join you when you find out what God's doing. You've seen that, Jody, back during the period where the church there in Pensacola was profoundly touched by the Pensacola revival.
Yeah, and I think that, there again, it started in my generation where we started getting so busy in the evenings and we weren't having dinner together or having it at separate times or whatever. And I think that if I were, talking to young people and as I've observed in my children's families, if you make that effort to have those family dinner times together and you talk about things and you talk about how you feel the Lord is leading you to do whatever, and include your children in that discussion, not just tell them what's happening, but what do you think about this, and to get them involved in going and cutting somebody's lawn, or taking a flower to their teacher just because it might make her smile or feel appreciated or whatever, and helping them to understand that is serving God. Doing those things are just as important as your minister standing up and giving a sermon on Sunday morning, because you, whether you're 5 or 6 years old, may be the only Jesus that person's going to see that week. And I'm so excited when I hear young couples talk about encouraging their children to take that step forward. They have a good idea, run with it. Let your kids do that, and maybe even learn something from your children.
Yeah, I think sometimes we sell our kids short.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
You look at the child Samuel. He was hearing the Lord, and there was his mentor Eli, who finally figured out that Samuel was hearing the Lord. He said, ask him, okay, say, Lord, go ahead and talk to me. Your servant's listening. And was encouraged in that. I've seen our granddaughter, one of our granddaughters, she was at a Christian event with her aunt, who was our daughter, and the little granddaughter began to sense. I mean, she had already asked the Lord into her heart, and she began to sense during a time when people were praying for each other. She said, Aunt Lizzie, I think that lady needs prayer over there. And she began to actually sense and operate in her own little gifting of responding to the Lord. And it was, as I heard the story, just very, very neat, low-key. It wasn't a little kid showing off. It was a little kid responding to the leading of the Holy Spirit. And children sometimes can hear a lot better than adults because we've heard so many different voices during our lives.
Amen.
I think that we have a real serious problem, at least in the American church, that we really don't have a high enough expectation of our young people. And I don't mean putting something in front of them and beating them into doing it. I mean simply expecting. What I grew up with was the expectation that as soon as you could do something, you were going to go ahead and do it in service. That's just the way my parents thought. We never had another idea. But I think we have a great deal of resistance, and that means that the kids are left out. I remember after a sermon or a service at our church here in Pensacola recently, it was Youth Sunday, and the youth took everything, and one of the youth preached preached that day, and I said afterward, I said, I could stand having us do that every Sunday. Several people said, yeah, that would be a good thing, but of course, Youth Sunday is still a once-a-year event. We don't really change this. If we're looking back at the marriage and ministry, if your kids were going with you in ministry in the church that you're serving or in whatever you're doing, that would be that much more time that you had with your children.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And that would solve some of the other problems. And I just think we kind of lost that expectation. We expect kids to need to be entertained until they go off to college.
Yeah,
that's what happens.
A spiritual adolescence. We've lengthened childhood in our culture, and we've lengthened the spiritual childhood, saying, okay, you've got to be to this age, and you need this, and you earn the right, and all those other things. And I think we, or like you say, Henry, sell them short. And I know there are times too, in the same way, I've kind of sold Marilyn short, but since I've been the more visible ministry partner in this, there have been times that in my own ego frailty, I've actually felt threatened. It may sound weird, but that's the reality. That if I had to share that, there probably wouldn't be enough to go around for me. And one of the things I've discovered where I go, that anytime Marilyn goes with me, I'm much more welcomed, and she brings her own set of gifts. And as I've grown and discovered healing in areas of my life that are broken, I've discovered in a new way how wonderful it is to have that complementary ministry, and to see that happen. And people are weird, and I've been weird about this too sometimes, and I've seen that in other ministries. And just because someone is involved in ministry, certainly they're not perfect, nor are they whole. And so she's bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, and we are a part one of another. And she is complementary. She completes me. She makes that. And I know we've got some friends in different places that are watching tonight, and if so, it's probably because Marilyn's on. They've seen enough of me. Yeah.
Well, I think that's part of what we were talking about earlier in knowing who you are, recognizing your gifts, and recognizing the gifts in one another. You know, it's so easy for us to make certain gifts more important than other gifts. You know, and I think we severely misread sometimes 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. You know, and you know the pastor is important. The administrator, you know, not so much, and the person who is teaching the scriptures at a you know, with high theology and you know, explaining the Greek and the Hebrew is more important than the person who's telling their own experience. And none of that is true. I remember a conversation with one pastor who said to me, he says, "Oh, I just find it so amazing what you can do with the biblical languages." And I was looking at him because I had been thinking, you know, I had been amazed at his gifts. And so finally I said, you know, well, I've just been so amazed how you can sit down with a couple and talk to them about their marriage and help them make things better. That's incomprehensible to me. Because, and we have all of those different gifts, you know, nobody calls me at 5 o'clock in the morning to pray with them about their stuff. They call Jody. Yeah. You know, nobody calls, you know, very rarely are they going to call her to say, okay, how do we interpret this particular passage? They call me. That's because we're different people.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not that, you know, it's not that God says, wow, I need Henry to be taking those 5 o'clock in the morning phone calls because Jody's the one who has the gifts and hears and knows what to say.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you a question, Jody. You know, you have not only had the experience, but have taken the opportunity to write about that in your writings about grief and the loss of a child and what it feels like. Ministry so often causes grief within families, separation from friends if you move to a different location or a different pastorate, grief where there's disappointments in the people you serve or with each other. What kind of glue do you find helps hold things together for a couple when they're facing this kind of tearing or facing loss and facing grief?
Well, I think the number one thing is to acknowledge that you have it. You know, I think that, and so often those of us who are in ministry, you know, we put that faith face on, and we sometimes get so good at it we actually start to believe it. And I think instead, if we would allow ourselves to say, I'm really going to miss you, and I hope you don't mind if I, you know, call you up every couple of weeks or so and just touch base with you, you know, or just to acknowledge that. And then the second thing I think is to not only acknowledge it within your family, but acknowledge it before God, you know, and say, look, yeah, I'm willing to go, but I just want you to know you're going to have to help me get over this because I'm not I'm not feeling real good about this right now. And to allow yourself that time to heal and find the strength to take that first step or the second step or whatever. I think that and to also acknowledge that just because you're out there doing the Lord's work and you're doing the good stuff and all that, that sometimes really awful things happen. That doesn't make you immune to them. I've shared before with people that our son James, his cancer reoccurred twice, and both times I was in Hungary doing a mission trip. And the first time was hard, but the second time, I want to tell you, I was really, really angry with God. because I was out there doing his work, and I could not get in touch with my child. I could not hold him. I could not hug him and say, oh my God, this has happened. And I think that the best thing that happened, there was a wonderful missionary friend of ours there. I felt comfortable enough to express my anger as well as my sadness to him, and he was comfortable in saying, yeah, it's okay. You're right.
Okay, well, since we have an audience question, I'm going to interrupt on that. From Chris, how do you keep yourself from becoming so ministry-minded and wanting to do so much for God that you leave your family behind? I'm looking at the time. This is going to have to be our last question. I'm going to give just a quick note. I think the most important thing is to always make sure that you are hearing from the Lord about what you want, what you're supposed to be doing, and not from other people. I know I've said that already this evening, but I think in the people in ministry, and this is, I've never figured out, if you want to talk about gifts, somebody someday will figure out why so many pastors have talked to me about their ministry when I am utterly not called to pastoral ministry. I have so little knowledge, but very often they talk to me, but so frequently, to me, their problems seem to come down to people are putting burdens rather than God putting burdens.
Something popped into my mind, Henry, as you were talking about that. I was reading in the Old Testament a couple of days ago, and the prophet was talking about how the people had sacrificed their children to try to get God's or their God's favor, and thinking that it was noble to do that, or sacrifice of the seed of their own flesh. And we have to remember, we don't earn Father's favor, and we don't earn the Lord's love by what we do. It's by grace that we're saved through faith. It's by grace that we have the ministry to which we've been called, and it's the grace that's going to sustain that. The Lord knows our hearts, and if there may be a time where you really have to make that choice and that call, but I believe that God wants the whole family to come along, just like Cornelius' household when Peter went to him in the book of Acts and shared that glorious gospel with him and his family, and they were all saved. The Lord brought them all together, and I believe it's possible for ministry families as well.
And at the risk of sounding like I'm bringing in a commercial again, I want to mention your book there on forgiveness, because you come back to that. That is really the foundation. That is the God that we're serving, and if we really believe the God who gave so that we can be forgiven, then we're going to know that we don't have to do more and more and more and more and more in order to earn the favor that we already have.
Yes.
And so that word forgiveness is just an awfully useful one.
Yeah.
And in a practical sense, as far as the marriage, and we still have to work on that. Our time together is have a date. Our kids used to love it when we said we had a date. We're going to have, Mom and Dad's going to have a date, because I guess they got to get in trouble while we were gone. I don't know.
Babysitter.
But and we need to keep those. We've gone through periods where we failed to really, since we're together, our office is here, location, and like you all have your office right there at home and everything. And so a lot of times you have to get out and go somewhere just together, leave the work. And you have to work on that as far as, number one, in a marriage to be strong. You have to do things like that. And I'm reminded again, even as we talk, that we need to do that too. So
we do too.
Yeah. I have something to say there for that.
Well, no, I just think that we just shortchange God. We just We just don't think that he's going to think of all these things and the importance of all these things. And if we just take a deep breath and say, God, what do you want me to do today? Mm-hmm. And then trust him if it's something so simple.
Okay. Well, that will be it for our conversation tonight. We've run out of time. I'll remind you that we hold these conversations every Tuesday night. Next week, I'm going to be talking with authors Elgin Hushbeck, Alden Thompson, and Alan Bevere. We're going to be talking about looking for the essentials of the faith. Recall I think it was John Wesley's comment that we were supposed to have in the essentials unity and the non-essentials charity, is it? Or in all else charity. But in any case, we're going to be discussing the essentials and the non-essentials of the faith with three people who spend a lot of time thinking about that. That will be next Tuesday night, 7 Central, 8 Eastern Time. Thank you for watching. Good night.